All right, we have a selfie. That means that we're ready to go. Welcome back from lunch break, everyone. Tea break, coffee break, or whatever you're drinking late in different time zones break. This next panel discussion is near and dear to my heart because of the topic and, of course, the esteemed colleagues that are taking part in the panel as well. People talk all the time about the metaverse as if it's this new thing that big tech is trying to bring into existence. Well, you know, there are people such as Zahid Amanullah, Laura Brown, Mohammed Khamis, and Kavya Perlman that have been around for decades and have observed lessons learned that we can apply from the internet era to the metaverse. In some instances, they've almost invented the concept, but they've certainly been around to understand the lessons learned that we can apply going forward. So Zahid is a resident senior fellow at ISD, leading on ISD civil society engagement, communications, and partnerships, coordinating the public and private sectors with activists, frontline workers, and relevant civil society networks. That is a full-time job. He has worked closely with Google.org to support British and European civil society organizations through Innovation Fund, the Shared Endeavour Fund, and the Google Impact Challenge on Safety. He has given testimony to the UK and European parliaments and has been featured at the BBC, NPR, Channel 4, Sky News, The Guardian, CNN International, The New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Le Monde Diplomatique, and Newsweek, amongst others. We also have, to my right here, fellow XRSI, Laura, who has 15 years of experience in education, 10 in education technology. She's a former industry experience that includes education policy research as well as data analysis at the Department of Education, lots of grant writing and multimedia product development, as well as global training implementation and policy-based reform. Laura has been teaching experience, including classroom instructions at the college level for quantitative methods for economics, applied calculus. I don't even know what that is, but I'll learn. And writing across the arts, multimedia writing and storytelling. Her product development work has been recognized by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She was grantee Next Generation Courseware Challenge in 2014. By Fast Company, she was a finalist for World Changing Idea in 2020, and various media publications, including the Washington Post, ABC's Good Morning America, ABC's Nightline, and Engineering and Technology magazine. Mohammed is an associate professor at the University of Glasgow, where he leads research into the field of human-centered security. He has made significant scientific contributions to the fields of human-computer interaction and security. He has over 100 publications on related topics, including safety, privacy, and security in virtual reality. Mohammed's research has been funded by the UK National Cybersecurity Centre, the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, and Royal Society of Edinburgh, amongst others. As you can tell, we have a lot of very accomplished folks. Laura and Mohammed are both advisors at XRSI. So we invited Kavya, also of XRSI, as you've heard today, to facilitate this panel. Kavya, I'm very honored to know now for several years, because she's not just a visionary behind Metaverse Safety Week. We all know her publicly as a cyber guardian, but she's also a great human being, in addition to being the founder and CEO of XR Safety Initiative. She is an award-winning cybersecurity professional with a deep interest in immersive and emerging technologies. She's a pioneer of the novel XRSI privacy and safety framework for the immersive technologies domain, security awareness in the metaverse, and various baseline security and privacy standards for emerging technologies. She really does a lot of work. I can tell you, she says she sleeps, but I don't believe her. She's built and contributed to several standards and laws for emerging technology domains and has won several awards for her work and has been named one of the top 20 cybersecurity influencers for 3 consecutive years, 2018, 2019, and 2020, and again for 2022 by IFSEC Global. Kavya serves also as a key member of Global Coalition and Digital Safety at the World Economic Forum and part of the Metaverse Initiative at WEF via XRSI. Kavya currently advises over 20 global governments on global policies for emerging technologies, as well as human rights considerations. Kavya provides oversight to Metaverse Standards Forum and Responsible Metaverse Alliance via XRSI as well. She's category queen when it comes to the pioneering of XR safety domain, and she founded the Cyber XR Coalition, which focuses on diversity and inclusion and the cross-section of cybersecurity and XR. She helped launch a trustworthy XR news platform, Ready HackerOne, established a medical XR advisory council, and last but not least, she actually invented the idea and really spearheads the Metaverse Reality Check, the MRC, which is an oversight board formed by the citizens via XRSI. Kavya, I'm so in awe of you and our other panelists, so please take us away and share with us your wisdom, knowledge, and insights.
Thank you, Christina. And wow, I imagined this moment so many times in my head, because the panel that we are assembled here today, well, first of all, I want to welcome you all to really pay attention to how the words, the intention, but the human behind the avatar that we are. I almost have tears in my eyes just kind of reflecting back on all the achievements that you were recounting, Christina. So thank you. And it's so wonderful to have you along for the journey, along with so many of the XRSI advisors, without whom I could not have done this. So I want to make sure that we all understand the responsibility of this whole new world. This has been my quest, my mission for now past so many years. Part of my introduction is I was at Facebook in 2016, and I saw firsthand what happens when technological risks are not addressed. And now, with this internet era, there is so much to learn. So without further ado, I really just want to dive in, and it's a completely unscripted conversation. I have to admit, there wasn't really enough time to prepare, but we have been preparing for this for like decades. And that's why I could count on all of these advisors to now dive into. Let's start with the very question, and let's take the whole time to reflect on this. Laura, I go over to you. Your top 3 considerations in terms of what internet era lessons can be applied to the metaverse.
Wow, top 3. The one I really came in here prepared to talk about was our sense of selves and the development of our identities as global citizens within this kind of new virtual world that we're embarking into, and being much more mindful about who we're developing into through our use of virtual worlds and the internet. I think we've seen a lot from the past 10, 15, 20 years of the way children have grown up on the internet, coming from Child Safety Day on Wednesday or on Tuesday now. Just thinking about all of these types of roles that we are seeing deficiencies in our real lives. And for folks who aren't maybe tracking this, we've had a really hard time recruiting doctors and nurses and teachers and police officers and all of these helper roles that require us to face distress and stress and kind of the pain of reality. And we really haven't been preparing our young people to take on these types of roles in society. And we're actually seeing these issues today. So that would be the one thing that kind of encapsulates a bunch of different points I could make about this, but being more mindful about who we're becoming and what we're spending our time and attention on in these new virtual worlds.
And I will get back to you and keep sort of reflecting together with me as we confront this reality of what lessons can be learned. I want to go over to Zahid. Zahid, what are these lessons? Do you have any top 3 that we can dive into? And you can unmute yourself.
That never gets old, does it? There's so many lessons to learn that we can pass over to this to the metaverse. Just from our background, we spent 10 years looking at online harms in the social media era, and there's so much that we learned with regards to roles and responsibilities of different sectors, of the tech sector, of governments when it comes to regulation, of civil society and what their responsibilities are, digital literacy, and so forth. And it has been a long process, and we spent, if you can imagine, for example, the regulation that's being considered, for content moderation and the like, That's after 10 years of, plus of social media use and monitoring trends and looking at some of the online harms that have resulted from that. So this is the beginning of a long process. We are in the infancy of the metaverse. We will have the benefit of learning how we navigated all of those challenges in the last 10 years. And now that we have regulation, that is pending in the EU and elsewhere, we can build on that and actually make sure that we have the trust and safety in the metaverse that will allow it to thrive.
And Mohammed, same question.
Yeah, so I think, so I echo what Zahad and Laura said, and also I think it's quite important to consider the privacy, security, and safety implications of the metaverse. So I think with the internet, because it was initially built without the intention of using it the way it's being used today, we had a lot of those workarounds to make things secure. But I think now we have an opportunity to shape things in a way from the beginning to ensure that the systems we use in the metaverse, the platforms, the applications are all built with the user at the center, with safety, security, and privacy in mind. And when I say security, of course, we think of cryptography and things like that, but also like studying how do people use those security systems. We don't want to end up using passwords because, people are not cognitively able to use passwords the way they are designed at the moment. We don't want to be using all the issues that we have at the moment in the internet. And similarly for safety, and I think this highlights a very important point, that we have a lot of dangers that are in the internet, and we have the risk of them being amplified in the metaverse. But then there's also like new types of risks, and especially with immersive virtual reality and augmented reality, there are also risks to physical safety and not just mental agency as we used to have before. So I think the top three things to focus on, in my opinion, are the security, privacy, and safety of our users.
Absolutely. And anybody, I'm happy to, let's have a more organic conversation. I don't have to necessarily Q&A you. As you know, we are collectively reflecting on the very question. From my perspective, there's just a couple of things that I would love to add. We've never considered that what's at stake here, and we've never drawn a framework in the internet era that addresses the human in the loop and the society in the loop. We have been talking about risks in terms of corporate risk, financial risk, reputational risk, but we've never addressed it the human perspective. There is an actual human in the loop, and the impact on our cognitive behavior, on our psyche, that translates to ultimately toppling even democracies or dictators. We've created powerful weapons at the internet era. So I think I would highlight that, is that what we are creating is a potential weapon that could be used against humanity, because there is this unique factor for human in the loop and society in the loop. And of course, we'll get to the solution piece of it, but I just wanted to really note that down, that we need a framework to actually address that and not just talk about risk in terms of finances, etc. Any thoughts from any of the panelists on that?
If I could, you hit a very, very important point. And as we've seen the way that current technologies have been used, for example, by extremist groups and others, disinformation, the recruitment of people for joining extremist groups, the mobilizing, and the propaganda that has been used by groups like ISIS, we can see that that's part of the human challenge, is to ensure that people who are either state actors or non-state actors don't use these technologies to disrupt society and make us all unsafe. And we have learned a lot in the last 10 years on how these people operate. Audiovisual stimulus.
Sorry, Zahid, I lost your audio for a second. Laura, do you want to jump in?
Sure. I mean, I'm thinking about the same thing in terms of what we're seeing in public safety. You're both making an interesting point around the human element and the societal element, and sort of what's the cart before the horse. What's leading what? I know that specifically within, you think of things like rape culture that we're seeing on college campuses. What's driving that? A lot of that's online kind of tribalism, groupthink, shared media, shared conceptions about how to relate to our peers. And these are still developing minds, obviously, in college campuses. But these are movements that are driving some of our largest public safety issues today, like we've been seeing over the past few years in the United States, especially. Disinformation and misinformation, very intentional campaigns that are being created to stoke fear and to drive action, most importantly, an action that benefits specific people and harms very intentionally other groups of people. It's not something that we've been terribly mindful of. I think that when we talk about safety by design, it's important for us to design for humanity, and not design for a happy path that will keep our revenue growth going, or our advertisers continuing to buy into our services, but to think about, what's the societal impact? What are we creating with this? What does it mean if we're feeding targeted advertisements to children? What are we doing to their identities? What are we doing to their sense of self? What kind of adults are they going to develop into, and what type of citizens are they going to develop into? Of course, we haven't spent a lot of time thinking about that, because none of us were thinking that we'd be using the technology in the ways that we're using it. I'm sure even Kavya, you were probably surprised by some of the things that you've seen in your career. But we've learned the lessons. We've lived through this now, and I think to not leverage those insights would be willfully negligent on our part, which is why it's so important that we're having this conversation.
So as Zahid comes back and joins the panel, I look to you, Mohammed, to kind of separate a bit about the idea of this security, cybersecurity, because, and let me paint that a little bit further. So when, Christina, you were talking about the category queen for XR safety, safeguarding extended reality takes into account cybersecurity from my perspective. It's like a subdomain that must be included, but I feel like we need to think about safeguarding extended reality. So if you could just dive in from, more of a technical perspective into what's so distinct about cybersecurity alone versus the safety that we keep talking about. Mohammed?
Yeah, sure. I think in terms of the problem is now, you've got security risks that could result in safety problems. So previously, it would have been very unlikely, or types of attacks where, for example, like cybersecurity attacks that would lead to your phone blowing up, for example, and causing physical harm to the user, are sort of not attacks that we see every day. But with for example, augmented reality glasses, imagine if people are walking around with AR glasses, and then you can, if, for example, a malware may project a bridge where there is a cliff, for example, or in VR, there's a lot of work on perceptual manipulation to enable new features. So, for example, if you're in a small room, you could have the user walk in circles, whereas they think that they're actually walking in a straight line because the environment is slightly moving. So this is actually used to give people the impression that they're in a bigger room. But using that same technique, you can have the user walk through a staircase or through a window, and this would have an impact on their physical safety. So I think the problem now is that there is a stronger link between cybersecurity and safety when we talk about extended reality. And of course, there's all sorts of risks that are not necessarily physical, but are quite serious, like Laura was saying, like, things like bullying or raping avatars, which could have a significant impact on people's mental health and mental agency.
Absolutely. And it seems to me from what you're saying is I often talk about it, the attack surface has gone from networks, nodes, and servers to our brain and all the way to our living spaces.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's very true, because it's we've got a huge amount of sensors and XR headsets just for them to function, right? And they gather a lot of data about us. There might be things that we don't even understand at the moment, that they could be inferred about us from our data that we will only learn about in the future. But this data is still being collected today. You have this nice slide that you use in your talks, Gavia, where it shows what could be inferred from eye tracking data, for example. And some time ago, even experts in eye tracking would have known that this type of data, like that you can infer someone's sexual orientation from their eye movement. That's quite, it's not intuitive at all. But then I wonder what will we find out in the future. For example, could be there other things that we can infer from the way, for example, we move our controllers, the way we move our hands, or the way we move our heads in conversations. So yeah, there's a lot of risk in that indeed, but we should be proactive about trying to find out what attackers could do and try to build methods to mitigate those. And the challenge here is to build those methods in a way that do not interfere with the functionality of the metaverse, because we also want to leverage the benefits of the metaverse.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And yeah, Zahid, please go jump in.
Yeah, Mohammed brings up a really, really interesting point in that, the way that people engage online has always relied on making these assumptions about what people are like, especially if you're trying to sort of, for example, groom someone, or if you're an extremist group, you're trying to recruit someone. Now the metaverse is sort of amplifying all of this. It's essentially hypercharging all the existing dynamics that have played out so far, and the ability to sort of target people in a nefarious way is going to become potentially a real issue. Now, fortunately, we've learned, some of the strategies that we can use to inhibit this from current, the way we monitor, for example, in our own research, the way we monitor gaming systems, which is probably the closest corollary to sort of the metaverse in terms of engagement and audiovisual stimuli and avatars and so forth. And how we can find a balance between the company's responsibility, the user's responsibility, and then of course regulation on top of all of that, that will work. So, we're, again, I mentioned before, we're in the early stages of the development of the metaverse. We have some time now to really analyze this trajectory and see if we can build on our research to make sure that we can get ahead of that curve.
And I do appreciate that insight, and at the same time, I wonder, do we really have some time? Because this is where I constantly go back to this Collingridge dilemma, a double-bind problem that once the technology is fully mass deployed and developed, we can't undo the harm. So I'm just really, I don't know, but why I keep feeling this sense of urgency. And then at that point, I want to draw into this one specific point that we have learned from the internet era is the power that is in the hands of some big tech monopolies. And further to that, I want to encourage you to a little bit reflect on this thing that I learned, firsthand, being the head of security at Linden Lab. A lot of the people do not realize what the metaverse is going to do is move economies on the online system. And that means these economical power will now rest at these big tech companies. So if they are becoming the super gods and the gods, and they have the power to just with one click completely disable your account that may be affiliated with your livelihood, because back at Second Life, Linden Lab, people created, grew their livelihood through that. So if you could please, all of you, Laura, starting from you, like, this is the kind of power that we are, we have already learned from the internet era, from Second Life and all that. Please reflect for me as to what are we to do better, and why is it so important to confront that?
Yeah, I'm trying to find a kind of framework to think about this. And in terms of my work, and I train law enforcement, I work in public safety. So where I'm coming from is seeing a lot of what's kind of the real world impacts that we're finding just from today's social media, to be honest, in terms of the companies do have a lot of power today. And we can argue whether or not they have a lot of responsibility. I think that there's, ethical considerations to be had in there, but also how and who's getting power on these platforms first, and kind of what does an early adopter in the metaverse mean? Who's going to be setting up the initial frameworks for economies, to what you're referencing, Kavya? What's going to be a black market on the metaverse? We can probably predict already from current law enforcement work what we're going to be seeing. A lot of what we're already seeing that we don't like, and on a completely different scale, in a way that's much more difficult for us to get ahead of and mitigate. Those are really important, but even just down to the day-to-day, what are we buying? How are we buying it? Where's target advertising going to go? What kind of societies, what economies are going to be built and be torn down? I think those are things we should be tracking already, just as we've been tracking them before the internet. We need to be more mindful about it.
Absolutely. Zahid, you want to jump into that?
Yeah, I echo those concerns. I mean, the more I think about where we're at with the metaverse and all the possibilities, looking at it from our perspective, which is online harms, there's so many possibilities, and again, when it comes to the power of tech companies and and the interoperability, for example, between different companies, and how's that going to be managed? Can you have profiles, for example, that can be transferred between companies, like you change your phone number from different providers? Are these who's gonna create and regulate these structures? These are all questions that we still have to answer, and all of this affects the innovation. On the one hand, you do want to promote innovation and allow that to sort of grow, but again, as you were mentioning, and I agree with your point about, you don't want things to get so baked in that you can't go back and undo it. That's why we really do need to think about, safety first, a multi-sector approach to these problems. Just to give you an example, we run an intergovernmental sort of network called the Digital Policy Lab, which brings together regulators from the US, Canada, Europe, and elsewhere to ponder these issues on a regulatory basis. And including civil society in that conversation, so we really need these robust multi-sector conversations in order to come up with answers to these. They can't just be answered by one company or another. So that's a start.
Absolutely. I definitely want to ask you, Mohammed, any thoughts on this sort of a big tech monopolization and potential solution? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
We just lost him.
Yeah, looks like we lost him.
He just came back.
Oh, sorry, I missed it somewhere. Somewhere else.
All right.
Okay. Yeah, no, I was just saying, I agree with what Zahid said about also I think a big problem here is that we have a lot of stakeholders. So there are the platforms, there are also the applications. There will be like developers of these applications. There are the users. There are the different organizations that are using the metaverse for their, for their work and for the economy in general. And I think, there is a big responsibility on each of those, and we really need to spread awareness about this, because a big problem, I think, is that there's a lot of developers, for example, of VR apps that embed a lot of functionality that could actually have a lot of harms and a lot of problems. Or, for example, don't know that they should have a very basic feature like having a bubble, for example, in a virtual environment. So some VR like platforms like Altspace, some platforms like it do not have such even basic features. So I think we need to spread awareness among developers. I think most of the big platforms are already realizing that this is a big thing. Like they need to prioritize security, privacy, and safety, and so on. But yeah, I understand the concern about that. Do we really trust them with this huge responsibility, and how can be there a sort of oversight? I'd like to say, legislation and policy, but I don't know if this will be enough, to be honest.
Yeah.
I don't have an answer to this, but I think a way to improve our preparedness to this is to spread awareness about the metaverse among regular people, basically, just to so that the users, who will eventually have a voice and will sort of hopefully influence how things will be in the metaverse in the future. I think such awareness would be positive. That people would know what could go wrong, but also have realistic expectations of what could happen and may not happen in a metaverse.
For sure. As we move on, I just want to kind of cap that and wrap it up to maybe we do need some new protocols to take that power back. Decentralization comes to mind. But I certainly want to move on because these economic powers otherwise would be too restricted to these big tech monopolies. But moving on to, I really want to get into some of the vulnerabilities. And so, Mohammed, I know you and I are more on the cybersecurity vulnerability side, so I would love for you to reflect on that part. But at the same token, there are these other vulnerabilities which we've learned from the internet era, are the human vulnerabilities, the societal vulnerabilities. So if you could first please dive into those kinds of vulnerabilities that are being exploited in the internet era and how they will be, how they might play out. And then certainly, Mohammed, I want to go over to you to talk about the technical vulnerabilities in traditional and novel, of course.
Yeah, I want to link that back actually to what Mohammed was just talking about with respect to the developers that we have building this technology and the almost maybe undue power that some, in terms of how we build this tech, a lot of folks don't understand what's actually going on inside of these black boxes of these tech companies in terms of how this technology is being developed. And it is a lot of implicit bias that's coming through their design work and their development work that's creating these new worlds that they're kind of literally developing on their own. So when we think about professional certifications and licensing in the future and how we prepare the people who are creating these features for us, ensuring that they're well educated and certified to do so, to establish that layer of trust, I think is going to be important. Just like we take a Hippocratic oath under, healthcare, in education, we have a similar kind of focus on the student. We really need to be thinking about what kind of ethical standards we're holding our technologists to that point. So those vulnerabilities you're speaking about, Kavya, I think there's a multitude of them. We're seeing them across every sector of industry in terms of the ways that all of these technologies are hitting everything from utilities and public governments and schools and education, the privatization of education and other things, the way that we're forming ideologies that drive our political decisions and discourse. A lot is at stake here. And I think that we should be asking for a lot more from our technology companies when it comes to thinking about the future they're creating for us.
Absolutely. And Mohammed, I want to go to you. However, Zahid, do you want to also just reflect on societal vulnerabilities that have been exploited in the internet era, and then how might that play out in the metaverse?
Yeah, sure. So I think one thing that concerns me a lot is child safety, especially that now we have a lot of the people who are adopting VR platforms and so on are children who use it as an extension to gaming. So I think societal problems like child abuse or grooming and things like bullying and so on are amplified when occurring in the metaverse. Other problems like from the internet era, things like dark patterns in that we see on websites, for example. There is a big a huge step in like how these manipulations could occur in the metaverse. So dark patterns are like design patterns or ways to manipulate the interface in a way or ways to adapt an interface in a way to manipulate the user into a certain decision. So, for example, shaming the user if they decline certain permissions, for example, to the system, or if they decline an offer, for example, or so. And we've seen that in cookies a lot, for example. And I think this could occur in VR at a much bigger level. Imagine, for example, that if you want to, for example, decline certain permissions, you would have to do something that is quite bizarre in the metaverse. For example, you, have to shoot someone or shoot an animal to decline permissions, for example. So, there is a bigger variety and a larger scape as a landscape for things that could be done to manipulate users in the metaverse.
Absolutely. Sahid, do you want to reflect on that?
Just building on what Mohammed said, the struggle to ensure that we have a digitally literate society has been going on for many, many years now, and we've learned that there are real societal harm that can come from, for example, the spread of disinformation, conspiracy theories, and the like. And the response to that is, it's been difficult to enact on a global scale. We've had, our own organization has had programs for youth digital literacy. In fact, we've done this in partnership with tech companies. We have created, for example, a program called the Business Council for Democracy, where companies have digital literacy programs in the workplace, because it's not just young people that need to be digitally literate. We've seen a lot of a lot of disinformation, for example, spread older populations, adult populations. It's truly a whole of society issue. Our schools aren't up to the task at the moment. We of course there's still debate on what digital literacy looks like when it comes to disinformation. But we're not going to build trust in these platforms and the metaverse in general unless we have a digitally literate populace, and we've got to work together across sectors to find out how to make sure that we can do this.
Absolutely. And we talk about vulnerable population, and Mohammed, you mentioned children. Laura, are there other vulnerable population that you are also concerned about that we really need to look out for?
Sure. In public safety, I think there's really nobody that's not vulnerable when it comes to the inability for us to predict how a threat actor is going to do something to us, whether it's to manipulate us or deceive us or cajole us into something, to irritate us, to coerce us to action. We've seen, some of the most privileged groups in this country driven to some pretty ridiculous behavior over the past few years, especially folks that, had every reason to not kind of fall into that kind of a victim sort of situation where they're victimizing others even. And I think that's also what's at stake here, is how we're defining all of these behaviors moving forward. Who is the victim? Who is the perpetrator? What's starting what's the full sort of supply chain of stimuli that's driving some sort of very major societal outcome like an election. We need to be really thinking long term and looking at way larger breadths of time in terms of how things are developing, instead of just using our attribution bias and looking at a very narrow window of time when we see some of these behavioral phenomena occurring that are driven by social media or the internet. So I'd say it's honestly a pretty open definition at this point. I'm particularly focused myself on individuals who live with various mental health conditions and states of being, as I like to call them, developmental conditions and disorders that leave folks very vulnerable to things like being scared into submission, elder abuse, receiving, scam phone calls, receiving scam emails that drives you to click, that makes you very easy to phish or catfish or coerce. Children are very vulnerable. They kind of take reality at face value. What you tell them, they'll often act on. We see a lot of sexploitation of children. These are all vulnerable groups. And honestly, I think we're going to see a whole array of different types of attacks being levied on folks in very subtle ways as well, moving forward. Something we need to be aware of.
Absolutely. And as you were explaining to me, it really is our collective responsibility to one of the things that I personally wanted to make sure that FTC, had the opportunity. I had only like 120 seconds to talk about the things, and I suddenly wanted to highlight that seeing is no longer believing. Like I'm literally right now sitting in my living room, kind of cluttered all over because it's been quite a busy time for past 4 or 5 days. But here I am in the Taj Mahal, so I'm seeing the Taj Mahal, but it's not actually real, and there will be augmentation, and there will be so much more that will be shown to us. We would be able to feel that through sensations, etc. And I think this is something to really worry about. Is the vulnerable population, we need to tell our society that this is happening. And we didn't inform people accurately that disinformation, deep fakes, deep news are taking place. There has been literal, murders because of those aspects. So as I say that, how can we potentially then learn and count to me some solutions here? Like, certainly the tone here is the prevention. And so I think that's where I look to all of you, like, what could be the potential then solutions here that we can kind of rely on as we lead towards the metaverse?
So I can add something here. Just also, before I talk about that, just a point about raising awareness, making people aware of the problems and so on. I think that's very important, and it's also I think it may because people may think, okay, this will make everybody freak out, and then nobody will be willing to use it and so on. But actually, it could also have a benefit. So in a recent research where we were asking people about their experience with children. Like if they've encountered children and virtual social virtual platforms, we asked parents and like if they would how do they manage with the children's use of social VR, and we asked what they those whose children do not use VR, like what kind of precautions they would take and so on, and we noticed that the parents who have never used VR. Some of them are really freaked out, and some of them are really, really worried. And those who have used them, they're sort of, because I think they've experimented with some of the safety features, so they are not as worried. So I think it's actually quite good to spread awareness, and it will not necessarily only drive people away. It's actually going to make people more confident about using the metaverse and letting people around them also use the metaverse. So back to the question you asked, Kavi, about solutions. So I think now we need to build security and privacy systems with the user in mind since the beginning. So the way we've been doing security in the past has been, we build a system, we find, oh, we have a security vulnerability. Let's, make it more secure. Let's ask people to authenticate. Let's create passwords. But then the problem with this is that whenever security is an additional layer on top of something that is already existing, it ends up being an obstacle in the user's way of achieving their main task. And the problem is that if you present it that way, it starts to become a burden on the user, and it starts to be something that is that they try to work around to get to the system and to get to do their tasks. So, for example, take passwords as an example. Initially, when passwords came out, they were like people had to use one password a day, and that's it. But then now we're supposed to memorize too many passwords. We should have unique ones for different platforms with different characteristics. But then we are not cognitively able to memorize all of that. And if you want to install like a security update, you need to shut down your applications, which is quite inconvenient. So people keep putting it off, and it's perfectly reasonable for people to do that. So we need to now build the metaverse with security in mind since the beginning, so in a way that it is integrated, such that it's not an additional burden. It's something that people like. The easiest way to perform your task would be also the most secure way to do it.
Absolutely.
Go ahead. If I could add to that.
Yes, please.
Yeah. So if just from the regulatory standpoint, because that's ultimately that's going to complement efforts to engage with users and to, of course, develop from the tech company perspective. But from a regulatory perspective, you know, a lot of the pending legislation, for example, in the EU, and the Code of Practice on Disinformation, of which Meta is a signatory, looks at content moderation. So that is, you know, in order to make sure that harmful content, even if it's legal, you know, is you know, prevented from being amplified at the very least. What does that look like in the metaverse? What does content moderation look like? You know, we've seen, for example, that, you know, live videos, live streaming on Facebook and other platforms is very hard to moderate. You know, after the Christchurch killings, you know, the metaverse is, of course, happening in real time. So, you know, this is another challenge that, you know, again, multiple sectors have to get together and figure out how to address, because people who want to target vulnerable minorities, for example, racial, religious minorities, gender minorities, and so forth, you know, there's some potential for some real harm there, and so we really do need to get to the bottom of this.
So
It's interesting. Yeah. Well, just kind of what you were saying, it's interesting how this is now an issue for a lot of folks of free speech, whereas before we've seen at least content. Not regulation, even maybe more television, but even with gaming, just understanding if something's for mature audiences. You know, with a lot of social spaces that we send our children into, we don't actually know who's in there or what's going on. And the behavior that's happening in these spaces is seen as an extension of ourselves. So that when we do try to have these kind of regulatory conversations, a lot of folks will come back with a free speech argument. Does that kind of play in at all into your work, conversations that you're having?
It does. I mean, you know, one of the things that one of our approaches, especially to extremist narratives, has always been responses to that, like, you know, counter narratives, responding with, you know, undermining the arguments of extremist groups, for example. That's always been, you know, a key strategy. We still do a lot of work in building resilience to targeted you know, communities so that they can defend themselves. But again, you know, from governments have a different view. They look at all of society, and they make judgments on curtailing that speech, especially in the EU. We just had speaking at a summit in Brussels, and the view there is very different. And they're a big enough market that often their laws will govern, possibly. You know, they're real heavy fines that are going to be levied at companies that in the coming years if they don't comply with those rules. So it's just an issue that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and I know we are kind of coming close to the end of the conversation, but we still have about 10 minutes to go. Before I dive into Q&A, I definitely want to pull this to another direction, especially because, as I talked about metaverse as a weapon, and we started with that sort of a, you know, premise, but currently there is a war going on the other side of the planet, and there are several wars that are already ongoing in the cyber domain, especially as a former cybersecurity, you know, frontliner. It's endless, the pings and the various types of cyber attacks. Whether you announce them or not, this is an endless and ongoing struggle. So I wonder, just to kind of reflect on those aspects of cyber warfare, and then kind of response that might be needed, because we were kind of caught off guard in 2016. Suddenly, entire democracy confronting that there are, you know, election interference, Russian influence. And then citizens around the world didn't quite comprehend what was happening. Is this a hack? You know, and as a result, you know, I've written about cyber political engineering. So what are we confronting here? And something that we can learn from this internet era that we can take forward to the metaverse with respect to cyber warfare and the kind of warfare that might be happening, potentially even incident response. Mohammed, I want to start with you, and then you, Laura.
Well, I mean, I don't have I don't have much to say here about other than that, you know, we're probably going to have like an amplified version of the harms and threats that we've got in the internet. But I can, yeah, I'm just trying to think if there is a particular problem that we see on the internet today that could you know, be particularly amplified.
What about some of the data sets, you know, or, you know, like a cognitive data sets? In your research, since, you know, I've been studying a lot of your material, there is way more amount of data now. And back in 2016, there were just 5,000 data points on each American. We're talking about way more data. This could really change the game when it comes to adversaries. What do you think?
So I think in terms of like in terms of warfare, for example, there is, of course, with AR and VR headsets, it's very possible to target someone in particular and to inflict harm to them. And when it comes to the data being collected, well, in addition to using this for surveillance, but also potentially you could find out about health problems that a person has through the data that is being collected about them. And for example, you could, for example, someone, if you know that someone has epilepsy, for example, and you want to inflict harm to that particular person, you can display certain things to them. And there's danger, of course, of finding out this information from the data that the user is sharing, even though it's not clear from the data that this is being leaked. And even if the user actually themselves doesn't know that they suffer from that problem.
Yeah. I mean, to that point, it's very similar in terms of what we see within law enforcement. We're doing investigations as well as we're looking for evidence of specific behaviors. But what we can often find is evidence of the individual. And as we continue to use these virtual worlds and virtual tools, we're literally building a digital or virtual twin of ourselves, not only in our self-expression or how we behave or how we think, but even things like our biometrics, our vital signs. These are being collected through our Fitbits and our smartphones and where we're going and what we're doing. This is an immense amount of data that could be leveraged for all sorts of things that are good and bad. I think it's really important for us moving forward into the future, at least to educate the folks who are around today and the new children that will be using this tech, what it means to protect our autonomy. And that's more than just our person IRL. It means our virtual lives as well, our digital data, and making sure that we're passing regulations where we get to own that data. If I want to shut down an account, I'm not leaving my data in Facebook. I'm not leaving my data with Fitbit. It's my data. And I should be able to control that moving forward because those could have implications not only for my privacy, but also for my long-term health and wellness. So those are my thoughts on sort of the personal data management.
I love that, Zahid. If you want to add to that, would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I echo all those points, especially the concern about data privacy, and that's going to be a bigger issue going forward with the metaverse in terms of all the data that can be extracted from our use of it. But going back just briefly to what you were talking about with regards to elections, we have studied a whole series of elections in the U.S., Africa, the Middle East, all over Europe, and how election periods are times when a lot of these online harms, especially with extremist groups and conspiracy groups and voter suppression and all of that, surges. And the network of different actors, state and non-state actors, often working in tandem to working together to disrupt societies, essentially. 2016, as you mentioned, was kind of the high point there for those people who wanted to do those things, both from the sense of how companies could protect themselves better from infiltration, obviously the literacy of users in terms of their understanding how to not be prey to disinformation, and even our technology in tracking these trends. We do a lot of this trend analysis. And I'll say that we have learned quite a bit in the last 4 years, especially, applying it to concurrent elections and learning some of those lessons. One of the things that I did in particular was to use our trend analysis to inform civil society groups on what was being said about them, so that they could defend themselves and so they could work on strategies to counter efforts to, for example, manipulate their narratives or to suppress their vote. So there are techniques that we can learn, that we can apply to the metaverse. We just have to be very observant of the trends and how they evolve.
Absolutely. And thank you for all these insights. I do certainly want to get to any questions. If you have any questions, please click the raise hand function, and I'll be able to address or our panelists will be able to address any questions. And while we wait for any questions from the audience, I do also want to close it more on the positive note, because we do concern ourselves with, a lot of data sharing, but at the same time, as Zahid, you're saying, that very data would help us lead to solutions, So I think we need to remember the context in which things are happening. Because sometimes, I had the chance to speak with one of the patients who was in extreme pain of a DBS, deep brain stimulation surgery. And unfortunately, she couldn't receive any virtual reality medicine because the two departments just didn't talk to each other. And so this kind of, like the data sharing within certain network and within certain contexts would actually lead to saving life. And that's why I think it's may even be more important to get to the granular context of that data, so we could learn from your trend analysis and caution people as to what the solutions might be. Laura, if you want to jump in, and if any final thoughts on there, and then we have 2 minutes.
I think that's a great point to end on in terms of public safety, and even with the law enforcement side of it. What we're focusing on is keeping our community safe in the way that the public wants it to be kept safe. So the more that we've got insights that's from safely protected data to understand how to do that, to mitigate, crime risks and opportunities, the better for us, honestly, long term. It's just important that we keep that data safe and secure and private while we're doing so. But I think that's a beautiful point that you're making, Kavya, in terms of the benefits can very much potentially outweigh the harms if we're playing our cards right in how we design and implement these technologies.
Absolutely. I'm seeing a couple of hands raised, actually. Yeah, please go ahead, Mohammed. I'm going to bring in Christina in the meantime. Please go ahead, Mohammed.
I was just going to add that, I agree with what Kavya and Laura said now, and also this type of social signals that we can collect from people while they're using the metaverse could also help us identify things like if the user is in distress, if they're experiencing harassment or bullying, or, for example, detecting health problems that could eventually allow us to provide them better medication. So it's not all dark, but some uses of the data will, of course, definitely be good. We just need to make sure the data is well protected and goes to the right person, and that the user's consent is taken into consideration.
Absolutely. We're almost on time, but I certainly want to allow at least one question. Christina, I see your hand raised. Would you be kind to share your question?
Hi, this question is for Laura. Just because of your training background, I'm wondering if you have thoughts on how we can mass onboard the population to the new technologies that make up the metaverse. Like, how do we mass educate for what's ahead?
Yeah, so for this type of change management, we typically fund that where the behaviors that we're looking to bring into the new environment have the most parity with what we're trying to bring in, right? So if I'm not going to go out to a playground where kids are fighting each other and say, this is the time where we're going to join the metaverse, we want to make sure that we're emulating the correct behaviors in an environment where they already feel safe, secure, and have a strong sense of self, and that we're bringing that into the new environment. And something like the metaverse or any virtual experiences would be that. So a safe and secure classroom. And honestly, kids aren't always safe and secure in their classrooms. And I think we need to take a good hard look at what we're doing in the real world too, with the no, instead of assuming we're getting everything right today. So that's kind of where I would think about this, is we need to think at scale. What's the best place in real life that should be the stewards and guardians of what the kids are doing or what people are doing in their virtual world?
Thank you both, and thank you. Thank you for these wonderful questions. And I just want to thank Laura, Mohammed, Syed. It's been really insightful for me personally, and I'm sure there is a lot more to reflect on. So let's continue our work, our conversation outside of this panel. Our speakers are still around, so if you want to ask the question or interact with them, you're welcome to jump into the virtual world, or those who are here, we're sticking around, so please feel free to talk to us. And thanks for staying around all week and even now. I believe we are going to take a 5 minutes break. Christina, is that, yeah?
Yep, we are taking a, actually, let's make it a 3-minute break so that we can be back on track. And we'll see everybody here at 2:50 p.m. Pacific time in 3 minutes from now.
2:50, we will be right back.